Bruce Chubb of Grand Rapids, Michigan, started his HO Sunset Valley back in the 1950s and has kept that original name even as his layout evolved over the years. Bruce was first published in a 1970 issue of Model Railroader magazine and wrote many articles for that magazine. Bruce is also known for his 1977 Calmback book on model railroad operation. In addition, Bruce invented the Computer Model Railroading Interface, or CMRI, which he first introduced to model railroader readers in 1985. CMRI is still one of the most used systems for adding signaling and automation to your layout. When Bruce retired in the early 1990s, he and his wife Janet moved to a brand new home with a much larger 2,600 square foot basement.
Well, the previous Sunset Valley was a freelance railroad, existed for almost 30 years, was totally complete. Every square inch was super detailed, and we moved the old railroad here, and parts that would fit in we kept, and a couple parts that we're modeling Southern California and San Clemente and so forth. We just scrapped those, but most of it we saved.
With that move, Bruce changed to a more prototype basis for the new layout, focusing on the Southern Pacific and Oregon.
I've always liked the Southern Pacific, and I love water, I love green, I love the lots of bridges and tunnels and mountains. So we picked Oregon as the main place where Southern Pacific has those attributes. And Washington and California, Northern California, and we're in 2,650 square feet. We've occupied almost every cubic inch vertically and horizontally, up to 4 decks. And the whole goal is to get as much mileage as you can for the run. So if you run a train from lower staging to upper staging, you're gonna go about 900 feet, or almost 3 football fields, as you wind around the basement. Add in the branch lines, which are very significant. In fact, the Coos Bay branch is longer than my previous railroad. You get about 1,400 feet of track.
By using a multi-deck approach with his new Sunset layout, Bruce was able to put what is probably 3.5 times the layout into his space. With this much space to fill with prototype railroads from the Western Oregon region, Bruce needed help researching the area since it's about 2,000 miles away from Grand Rapids.
As far as the prototype research, it's kind of difficult when you live a few thousand miles away from where you're trying to model. And to do the research, I contacted everybody in the layout design SIG and the op SIG that lived in that area. I contacted everybody in the SP Historical Society, UP, SP&S, and about a third of the NMRI members that lived in that area, and asked if they would like to contribute in research. I got about 85% response, and most of them were very favorable to respond because they said, geez, I've read your books and your articles, you've done so much for me, I would love to help you out in research.
Bruce has filled 6 file cabinet drawers with information on railroads in the Oregon area. He has a file folder for each industry, prominent structures, as well as data on tunnels and bridges. As an example, take his folder on Terminal 4 grain in Portland, Oregon. They have unique elliptical grain bins that Bruce has modeled faithfully on his layout. And as you might imagine, Bruce also has a good collection of books on the railroads of the region.
Most people model 1 railroad or maybe 2, so they have to buy books for those couple railroads. When I'm modeling 10 railroads, and at least 6 or 7 of them have books, and multiple books, you can get a sizable investment in books, and I fill a whole basic bookshelf on it. But the books are vital if you're going to do prototype. You've got to have them.
So which railroads is Bruce modeling?
Well, the main one we're modeling is the Southern Pacific, and we're modeling it from Portland, Oregon, down south to Dunsmuir, California. And that's westbound on the prototype. Everything towards San Francisco is westbound. And we're doing it over the Siskiyou line. We did that because that's through the old stagecoach route, and it's solid industry and small towns. A good share of it is just like Eastern Railroading out west. So you got lots of way freight operation, which is something I wanted that still existed strong in 1955. Then off from that main line at the town of Eugene, we're modeling the Coos Bay line that goes out toward the coast to the town of Coos Bay. And then we'll even be modeling beyond that in the museum setup, going to Powers, which will be operated by the Coos Bay Logging Railroad, with one local on that line that is Southern Pacific. And then we're modeling the SP&S, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle. We're modeling that coming in from Spokane into Portland. Back up just a little bit. Lower staging represents 3 different railroads. So SP&S trains will come in from lower staging. We're modeling the Wilbridge Yard in Portland for SP&S, and then we're modeling the subdivision of Portland of SP&S that goes from Portland to Eugene. And it kind of goes separate from the SP and comes together side by side in some cases in the major towns of Albany and Salem. So we're modeling it through both those towns. I started out with a plan that I wanted to have a lot of interchange. And I started out with kind of I didn't want just dummy interchanges. So I started out with an interchange of SP&S and SP in Salem like it really exists. And there's 2 separate locations, LaBisse and Front Street interchanges. I modeled both of them. And then I modeled the interchange in Albany, and then I said, gee whiz, I should connect those interchanges together, and I'm modeling the whole SP&S. So that's what we ended up doing. So we're really running SP&S trains, we're running SP trains, we're also running Union Pacific trains as they come in from Pocatello. And in Portland, we've got modeling the whole Albina Yard of UP, and we're modeling the Terminal 4, the Ocean Seaport, served by the UP. And then we're modeling the Great Northern, where they share the yard with the Northern Pacific in Portland. It's called Lake Yard. We're modeling that yard. We're modeling Union Station in Portland, which is their main central station that serves all the different railroads. And back in '55, they ran about 16 trains in and out of that station. We're modeling all the passenger trains in 1955 except for 2. So we're modeling UP passenger trains, we're modeling SP, SP&S, a Great Northern, and a Northern Pacific. So it's a very colorful railroad to run down here because you're running all the different railroads and all the different color schemes.
To service all these railroads, Bruce's layout models a number of prototype yards from the region as well.
The classification yards are really, the largest one is Eugene. On the prototype, after our era, it became a double hump yard and was designed to handle 80 trains a day. We modeled it before the hump, and we have 10 tracks, 10 classification tracks, and it is our largest classification yard, and it classifies trains going in both directions on the SP. The SP&S starts in Eugene, and it's a separate yard in Eugene. It's called OE Yard for Oregon Electric, which is the owner of the trackage before it was bought out by the SP&S. The second biggest yard is the Brooklyn Yard in Portland, and that is strictly Southern Pacific. Southern Pacific ends in Portland, so it's kind of a terminal yard. And what we've done is, in my old railroad, that was Fillmore, when I freelanced. And I had there a Fillmore station that was copied after Frank Ellison, back in the 40s, a very famous railroader, 40s and 50s. And all my researchers, not a good majority, but 60 researchers said, you've got to keep Fillmore Station. That's a landmark. It's well published, so I said, okay, we're going to keep that. So we made that be Harriman Station, which serves the UP and the Southern Pacific. And Union Station services the NP, the SP&S, and the Great Northern. And if you really study the operation of the real railroads, there's a lot of interchange traffic in 1950s, where cars came off from SB Cascade, they went on another railroad to carry on to Seattle, and so forth. So now we have a lot of interchange, not just between tracks and Union Station, between tracks and Herman Station, but we also have to shuttle some cars back and forth during an operating session between the two stations. So it really makes passenger operation much more enjoyable and fascinating than a lot of people think. In Portland area, we're modeling the Albina Yard, which is, in our case, is a 7-track yard. And it serves about 10 or 15 industries. It serves the ocean port of Terminal 4. And it's run by UP switchers. And then we have Lake Yard, which I guess I talked about, but it's served by the Northern Pacific Terminal and handles both the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. Then we have the SP&S yard in Eugene, OE yard, and it's a small yard right now, but it will become a full-fledged yard when we move to a museum with its own switcher and its own yard master. And then we have Coos Bay Yard, and it is a 6-track yard based on a curve, exactly like the prototype, with a Y. Inside the Y is the 3-stall roundhouse, like the prototype, and the station, like the prototype. The industries modeled in almost all these towns are exact, or very near exact replicas of a real industry at the time.
To help keep things moving on this much railroad, Bruce has 2 dispatchers and 2 different CTC panels.
We've got 2 CTC panels, which is very fortunate because there were 2 major manufacturers of CTC machines in 50s, 60s, 70s, lever-type machines. One was Union Switch and Signal, and that's our Southern Pacific machine. You can always tell an Union Switch and Signal machine because the bottom part is kind of an olive drab green, and the upper part is black. And that's one brand. The other brand or manufacturer is General Railway Signaling, and their panels are all black. Union Switch and Signal are all stamped out of steel, and then wherever you don't want to use holes, they're filled with plugs. The GRS ones are custom built for each application, engraved. And so when you come down here, you can see both. You can see everything that was used in the 50s. It's like a museum. Here's how this manufacturer did it. Here's how this other manufacturer did it. And we've got both as examples, and you can sit down and operate both. They fundamentally do exactly the same thing, but they do it considerably different from the standpoint that the knobs are different. The placement of the knobs are opposite, one manufacturer than the other. The lights operate differently and so forth. Right off the bat, GRS, you got 90 degree, plus or minus 90 degree travel on your signal lever. On Union Switch and Signal, you got plus or minus 30 degrees. The way they function is different, but what they accomplish is exactly the same. And here you can operate both styles. I don't know any place else in the world where you've got both examples in the same setup.
One aspect of Bruce's layout detailing that sneaks up on you is his passion for structure interior detailing.
I've always been deeply involved in the art of model railroading, including super detail. I just think it makes your railroad come alive. So not only do we detail the exterior, scenery and everything else, but we'll go for all the buildings up close, we do full interior details. So our post office, I even claim that when you look at the sorting the mail, you can even see the 3-cent stamps. I want to make sure people see that, because that's what stamps were in 1955, were 3 cents for a first-class stamp. So they look closer, but then they kind of feel that I'm probably just jostling them just a little bit, because even with a microscope, I don't think you'll see the 3-cent stamp. But you do see the letters and sorting the mail, full interiors, and we've got a flock of volunteers. I mean, Janet's dad retired early just so he could work full-time on the Sunset Valley Railroad.
Walking around Bruce's layout, removing the roofs on the structures near the aisle never fails to surprise you with lots of interior details. Here is a signal tower in Lake Yard, and a shop in Canby, Oregon. And this open lumber mill in Riddle, Oregon is loaded with detail. Nearby, also in Riddle, you can find this store, Bruce and Jan's, named for Bruce and his lifelong wife Janet. This van out front has a rarely modeled open back door. Removing the roof reveals a fully detailed interior. And then there's this shop in Ashland, Oregon. The Sunset Valley is loaded with such super detailed structures along the layout fascia. Even though Bruce has many detailed structures on his layout, he's also got a long list of still more structures he and his volunteers are finishing, such as this flour mill in East Portland.
Sperry Flour is one of the most prominent buildings in the East Portland industrial area. And on the prototype, this is a whole city block it occupies. And we, of course, had to shrink it down. And instead of 4 adjacent tracks, we just have 2 adjacent tracks. We have 2nd Street here, and then 1st Street, which is a double-track main line, Southern Pacific. It never actually was a street. It was always a railroad, but it was called 1st Street. And Sperry Flour is very prominent, and we're very proud to have it added within the last couple months to our museum scene. And the decals are all handmade and printed in a printer, and the multi-colors, and works very, very hard to get a paint that exactly match what the colors of a prototype is in the era that we're modeling. And next we'll be painting adjacent buildings here and getting it, the whole area more finished.
Bruce's passion for layout detail doesn't stop with the urban industrial areas. It extends to rural areas as well. On a layout this large, Bruce gets help from many volunteers to detail both the urban and rural scenes.
We're visiting the Fruit Growers Supply Railroad, camp number 18. It was a logging railroad operating out of Hilt, California, that went bankrupt, and the Fruit Growers Supply bought it and renamed it Fruit Growers Supply Railroad, and they supplied the orange crate material for 10,000 fruit growers in California. Most of everything you see here was built by Skip Like. He is a master model railroader, one of the top people in the country, specializing in logging railroads. And he built all the different log donkeys, a lot of kits, 100 or more pieces per donkey. and built them for actually 4 different logging camps on this railroad. The water tower here was built by Janet's father back in the late 60s, and the sand house both were built by him. The engine facility was built by Skip Like that we're talking about earlier, who's really the master model railroader and a top expert in the logging area and did all the work on our logging areas. All the lines here are made out of called Easy Line, and it's an elastic thread that can stretch several times its natural length. So if you reach into the seam, you don't destroy anything or cause any problems at all. And then the logging camp up here again was built by Skip, and they operated shays until 1954 on the prototype, and we extended that 1 year, so we're running shays on the Fruitgore Supply Railroad on the Sunset Valley system, pulling up about a 6.7% grade on an S-curve and taking empties back up to 2 other logging camps that are up in the high country. And then it'll come back with a load of logs that will eventually be interchanged with the Southern Pacific, and they service 3 sawmills that we're modeling in the Dillard-Riddle area.
Bruce's modeling goals aren't just about looks. Operating his layout looms large in the hobby for him as well.
On the old railroad, we operated for about 30 years, 1 night a week, every Thursday night. We ran about 1,000 operating sessions. Went into a lot of special sessions too. On the new railroad, we started operating pretty darn quick. Because we moved all the previous modules here, so a lot of it was pretty finished looking fairly quickly. And we started operating, and currently we are operating 3 days a month. We want to increase that before long and get more construction done to 4 days a month. We run a pretty long operating session. We start at 9 o'clock most days, and we end at 4:30. Our joy really is operating the railroad in a prototype manner and expanding that knowledge base to additional people and give them the opportunity to really know how a real railroad works.
Ever since Bruce started his layout in the early days, he's had in the back of his mind the notion that the Sunset Valley would outlive him.
And it was all built to begin with in modular sections. And our plan ever since the early 70s was to put it in a museum someday. So we will be disassembling all this and moving it in a few years and expanding aisleways out to 8 feet for better operation and better public viewing.